You don't drown because deep water pulls you under. You drown because you keep clutching the weight dragging you down. Daniel didn't see that in the beginning. Most people don't. He woke up each day with the same heaviness in his chest, not from fatigue, but from carrying yesterday into today. The room around him was silent, but his mind was anything but. It replayed the fears he kept postponing, the job that drained him, the relationship that felt like walking on shattered glass, the goals he couldn't reach, the ideal version of himself he kept failing to become. A lot of people live like this. Maybe you do too. Maybe the first thing you feel when you open your eyes isn't motivation, but pressure, not excitement, but the weight of all the things still unresolved. Taoist philosophy says something simple and sharp. Pain doesn't come from life itself. Pain comes from gripping what no longer belongs in your life. Nature doesn't cling. Leaves let go when the season changes. Rivers don't cling to rocks. The sky doesn't argue with storms. But humans, we hold tight to the things that wound us. Daniel did the same. He didn't realize it, but he wasn't tired from life. He was tired from refusing to release what was hurting him. And that's where his story begins. Chapter 2. The job he couldn't admit was draining him. Daniel's work looked perfectly normal from the outside. A stable desk, a steady paycheck, daily routines. But inside, it was hollowing him out one piece at a time. Every morning when he walked into the building, his chest tightened, as if his body knew the truth he kept avoiding. He forced a smile, forced productivity, forced himself to act fine. Maybe you felt this, a place or responsibility that quietly drains you while you pretend it doesn't. Taoist wisdom says, anything that requires constant force is out of alignment. Nothing in nature flourishes when it fights its season. Trees don't bloom in winter. Water doesn't climb uphill. Nothing living grows by pretending. But Daniel didn't know how to admit that. He feared disappointing others. He feared starting over. He feared looking like he couldn't handle it. So he held on tighter, thinking effort could fix something already misaligned. But effort can't repair what your life has outgrown. Sometimes the bravest act isn't pushing harder, it's finally stopping. Chapter 3. The relationship he didn't want to see was ending. He rarely talked about it, but the truth followed him into every room. At home, the tension was subtle but persistent. Arguments that sparked from nothing. Days of emotional distance. Nights sharing a bed but not a connection. He wasn't angry, he wasn't resentful. He was simply drained. Not because she was wrong, but because the bond they once had no longer lived between them. Maybe you've been here too. Trying, hoping, pushing, but everything feels like lifting a boulder uphill. Taoist wisdom says, when connection stops flowing, forcing it only deepens the wound. Relationships are like rivers. They move when both people move. But Daniel carried more weight than he could hold. He felt guilty even imagining an ending. He feared hurting her. He feared being alone. He feared failing at love. So he stayed, and staying became its own source of pain. Taoism reminds us, clinging does not preserve love. Clinging suffocates it. The hardest part wasn't losing the relationship. The hardest part was admitting it was already gone. Chapter 4. The habits that shrank his world when overwhelmed. Daniel didn't face the truth. He escaped it. He scrolled endlessly through social media. He watched meaningless content. He snacked to feel comfort. He stayed up late. He numbed himself with little distractions that didn't break him instantly but weakened him slowly. Maybe you've done the same. Not confronting what hurts, just getting through the day. Taoist teaching says what you feed grows. What you stop feeding fades. Every time Daniel avoided the truth, he fed his fear, his stress, his exhaustion. Avoidance felt safe, but it kept him stuck. He wasn't lazy. He was overloaded. He wasn't failing. He was carrying too much. His habits weren't the issue. They were symptoms of a life that no longer fit him. Chapter 5. The breaking point had happened on an ordinary Tuesday. He got home, dropped his bag, bumped a glass, and watched it shatter. And something inside him shattered too, not because of the glass, but because it was the final weight on a stack he'd been balancing for years. He sat on the floor, breathing like the walls were closing in. Nothing new had gone wrong. Nothing dramatic had happened. It was every small burden he ignored finally overflowing. Maybe you know this moment, when one tiny thing pushes you past your limit. Taoist philosophy says, rigid things break, flexible things bend. Daniel had been rigid with himself for too long, forcing everything to stay together, forcing himself to stay strong. His breaking was not a failure. It was an awakening, a message that something needed to change, not later, now. He realized he wasn't falling apart. He was finally hearing the truth. Chapter 6. The realization that night, he didn't numb himself. He didn't run. He didn't distract. He sat with his thoughts, really sat with them, maybe for the first time in years. And he noticed something life-changing. Everything causing him pain was something he refused to release. The job, the relationship, the expectations, the pressure to be someone he wasn't, the fear of disappointing people, the guilt of wanting a different life. He wasn't sinking because life was too heavy. He was sinking because he clung to what was pulling him under. Taoism calls this a return to awareness, a moment of clear sight, without filters or fear. Daniel saw he was fighting currents stronger than him, trying to hold together what was already unraveling. And he asked himself the question that redirected everything. What am I so afraid of losing that I'm willing to lose myself instead? Maybe you need to ask that too. Clarity doesn't come from control. It comes from releasing what was never meant to be held so tightly. Chapter 7. The release letting go didn't happen instantly. It rarely does. But the next morning he woke with honesty instead of denial. He admitted his job wasn't for him anymore. He acknowledged his relationship wasn't alive. He recognized his habits weren't helping him heal. He faced things gently, one truth at a time. He sat in his car before work and quietly said, "This isn't my path anymore, not emotional, just real." At home, he finally had the conversation he'd been avoiding, not with anger, with clarity. And for the first time in years, he felt space open inside his chest. Letting go hurt far less than holding on had. He didn't flip his entire life upside down overnight. He simply stopped fighting what was already falling apart. That's Taoist wisdom. When you stop forcing the wrong direction, life gradually returns to balance. Not magic, alignment. Chapter 8. The shift toward flow. The changes were tiny at first, almost unnoticeable. He slept better. He ate with intention. He stretched, walked, breathed deeper. His mind felt lighter, not silent but clearer. When you stop carrying what isn't yours, your body finally exhales. Taoism calls this harmony, the natural return of movement when the river is no longer blocked. Daniel wasn't suddenly joyful or successful, but he was aligned. He felt space, space to think, to feel, to rebuild. Life responded. Problems felt less like traps and more like choices. Silence felt peaceful. Stillness felt strong. That's what letting go gives you. Not loss. Room to live again. Maybe you feel this stirring inside you too, a quiet pull toward change. This is where courage begins. Not loud courage, gentle courage. The courage to release what you've outgrown. Chapter 9. The invitation to you, Daniels. Story isn't unique. It's the story of anyone who held too much for too long, anyone who stayed after their heart left, anyone who forced a life that was already trying to evolve. Maybe it's your story too. Maybe you're holding on to a relationship that's slowly draining you. Maybe your job is costing you more life than it pays in money. Maybe expectations you once accepted no longer belong to who you are becoming. Maybe you're protecting a version of yourself that no longer feels true. If so, hear this: letting go isn't failure. Letting go is finally listening. Taoism teaches that life speaks through how things feel. It's not about running away from difficulty. It's about recognizing when you're swimming against a current that isn't yours. You don't need a perfect plan. You need enough honesty to stop forcing what is hurting you. The moment you release even one thing not meant for you, everything else begins to shift. Your breath changes. Your thoughts change. Your clarity returns. Daniel didn't change because he became stronger. He changed because he became truthful. Now it's your turn. Ask yourself, what am I holding on to that is holding me back? Let the answer rise. Let it guide you. You deserve a life that doesn't hurt to hold. When you release what breaks you, you make space for what builds you. Let go, not to lose, but to finally begin.